A Southerner, a soldier, and a scholar, Ty Seidule hopes to dispel the myths of the lost cause of the Confederacy fighting the historic Civil War and illuminate the truth of America's racist past. Professor Emeritus at West Point, Ty Seidule discovered a great myth and lie that permeates culture to this very day.
And what I'm doing is I'm metaphorically punching people in the nose with the facts by saying Robert E. Lee committed treason to preserve slavery.
Was it courage or conviction that compelled Ty Seidule to write this very raw account?
I knew the facts. I knew the Civil War was about slavery, but it didn't get me in the gut. It didn't change my way of thinking.
Ty pulls no punches with calling things out, and he has a very good reason why.
I would never call him General Lee. Last time he served honorably was as a colonel. He was part of an erectionist force. I never say General Lee. You could say Colonel Lee because he served honorably then until he abrogated his oath.
As a boy growing up in Virginia, Robert E. Lee represented the heart and spirit of America, a hero, the greatest general of the Civil War. And that, with layers and layers of reinforcement of that ideal, kept men like Ty and those that were fighting in their only war certain that they were the honor and the pride of these United States.
So every part of my life made Lee the greatest man in history. And so that's why I have to tell this story, is because I grew up with these lies.
Seidule says that if you learn your history, you can change the narrative. Now, why would we change the narrative if the narrative was not accurate and honest? What a tough realization you had to have, Ty. I'm so glad that you're with us to join us for this special series with the St. Louis County Library and our partner, our bookstore partner, Novel Neighbor. So thank you for being with us to talk about this very important idea.
Well, it is, Jay, thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk to you. I'm thankful for the St. Louis County Library, for Novel Neighbor. What a great afternoon to talk.
Well, I can tell you that everyone is very excited about your book. It is Robert E. Lee and Me, and we are talking about the pursuit of a myth that has been embedded in our entire history. We have overwhelming evidence that you are able to provide that maybe what we thought was the historic account was not so accurate. Ty, I want to really emphasize and share why you're uniquely qualified to help explain.
I just retired from the U.S. Army after 36 years. The reason we have a great military is because we represent a great country. And so I served my country for 36 years and in peace and in war. I spent 20 years as a professor at West Point, and I'm retiring as a Professor Emeritus of History there. And now I'm at Hamilton College as a Chamberlain Fellow. So I'm a soldier, a scholar, and a Southerner.
Well, let's talk about that Southerner part and the backdrop for this story. Why is it so important and key that you, being a Southerner, were able to see and explain the variance, the difference between the history we understand and the history you were able to uncover?
Because, Jade, I grew up with these lies. So, when I was a kid growing up in Virginia, every part of my background told me that that the Confederacy and Robert E. Lee were great men. And so, in fact, if you would ask me, what did I think of Lee? On a scale of 1 to 10, I would have put Lee at an 11. And even though I went to church every Sunday, I would have put Jesus at about 5. So, that's it. So I'm not talking that I liked him. I revered him. And every part of my life did that. So in fact, I was going to school in Alexandria, Virginia at Douglas MacArthur Elementary School. And I was bused across town to the segregated Black school. What was the name of that segregated Black school? Robert E. Lee Elementary School. So every part of my life made Lee the greatest man in history. And so that's why I have to tell this story, is because I grew up with these lies.
Now, we're going to talk about some of that, the changing the narrative.
Mhm.
The narrative was the hero story that we just referenced and that you embraced and walked in proudly and even showed out a little bit, and marked your entire life. And that probably made you a bit disarming, with your credentials. But your historic discovery factors into your credentials. So it seems like everything about what you knew has become upended, and you're ready to go ahead and stand behind that and call it a myth that it is.
Right. Well, and remember, so I went to I went to school, elementary school in Virginia, and then I went to high school outside of Atlanta, Monroe, Georgia, in Walton County, to a segregated school. I mean, segregated. In other words, it was a segregation academy. It's one of those schools that started right in the late '60s when integration really came, and these schools popped up like mushrooms all over Georgia. 400 of them in Georgia alone. And I went to school, high school, in one of these schools, and I wanted to be a Virginia gentleman like my heroes. Robert E. Lee. And so where did I go to college? Washington and Lee University. I mean, nicknamed the generals, after these two. And so, in fact, I took my commission, Jade. I took an ROTC scholarship because I ran out of money. My parents got divorced. I had no money. So I took an ROTC scholarship and I took my commission, raised my right hand, and took my commission next to my portrait of my hero, Robert E. Lee, surrounded by Confederate flags.
Well,
So I mean, every part of my life led me to this myth.
You did all the right things. You crossed all the T's and dotted the I's, lived your life as an upright gentleman. What was it like for you to, I can imagine the shock and astonishment and even disbelief if everything about me turned out to be a lie. Is it really everything? And if it is, does the explanation or excuse of emotion or attachment exonerate what happened?
No, because this lost cause myth that I grew up in doing had a really nefarious purpose. So this lost cause myth is that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. We know it totally was. That in fact, enslaved people were happy. That was part of the myth, which is an abomination. Slavery features the lash, illegal rape, selling families apart for profit. It also says that Reconstruction, an era when we became more equal, when there was school starting in the South, when there was equal rights in the 14th Amendment, when there was Black men that could vote and serve in high office, they said that was evil and a failure. And at the top of that was Lee, who is this great soldier. But the purpose of it was to support white supremacy. And that's the key. These Confederate monuments that went up are another pillar of the of white supremacy. So if you think about what the pillars of that society are, it's after the Civil War, it's segregation, it's Jim Crow, disenfranchisement, it's lynching, it's white political violence, and it's these Confederate monuments to create a racial police state. So the South of my birth is a racial police state meant to enforce white political power. Mm-hmm. So these myths aren't just, they have a bad purpose. And that purpose is to enforce white political power at the expense of equality, particularly for Black people. So there was a John Updike, great writer, once said that telling the truth is a ruthless act. And he said, a writer's job is to rub humanity's face with the facts. Yeah. And what I'm doing is I'm basically I'm metaphorically punching people in the nose with the facts by saying Robert E. Lee committed treason to preserve slavery. So he committed treason. Let me tell you that. So there were 8 U.S. Army colonels from Virginia when that state finally seceded on the May 23rd. 8 U.S. Army colonels, all West Point graduates, all from Virginia. 7 of them remain loyal to the United States. 7. Only 1 decides to commit treason. And treason is levying war against the United States. That's what the Constitution says. And why did this one person, Robert E. Lee, choose treason? Because of his undying belief in human enslavement, as slavery as a social system. That's what he believed. He was the largest holder of enslaved people in the Army, benefited from it greatly, was a cruel enslaver, whipping, breaking apart families. So we've got to be willing to tell the truth. And part of it is that people like me have got to do it as well. So I think that's important. We did a memorial at West Point. It was my idea to create a memorial to all those who had died in West Point's wars, in the U.S. wars, from the War of 1812 through the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had 100 West Point graduates die in those wars,
Oh,
100. And we needed a way,
yes.
huge, we needed a way to recognize them. So I had all this plan, but the question is, would Confederate graduates go in them? And I said, no, the Confederate grads fought for, the West Point graduates, they fought for the wrong team. They killed U.S. Army soldiers. Remember,
Lee and his... This is the story. You're saying we're not North and South.
No.
We're not Union Confederate.
No.
We're not talking about red versus blue or blue versus gray here.
Right.
We're talking about the United States had been established.
Right.
And then because the preservation and expansion of slavery was so visceral and important to these Southern enslavers that they were willing to fire, hurt, attack, dissent, and insurrect what had been established as America that we had all pretty much agreed on. Isn't that part of the insurrectionist past anyway?
Yeah. I always hear United States Army. So it wasn't the Union Army like it was some lost to history that only fought one war, the Union Army. No, it was United States Army. The same one you fought, the same one you wore. You were in the U.S. Army. You wore that blue coat. The same blue coat Grant wore. You know who picked that blue color? George Washington. He picked the blue color that we wear today. And the same U.S. Army. So Lee and his fellows killed U.S. Army soldiers. So that's one. I will use U.S. Army, not Union Army. Two, they're not plantations, enslaved labor farms. They're not, I would never call him General Lee. Last time he served honorably was as a colonel. He was part of an erectionist force. I never say General Lee. You can say Colonel Lee because he served honorably then till he abrogated his oath. So and it's not a slave. It's an enslaved person. The enslaved desperately sought, and did get their freedom. And the other thing is, remember that U.S. Army had 190,000 United States colored troops that were fighting for their own freedom, and that fought and won that war. 10% of the force. And by the way, they used to be enslaved, helping the Confederate, and now they're on the other side, and a big part of the reason why.
What do you think of that?
You guys love, man. I love the story of the USCT. Man, they were amazing soldiers fighting. Can you imagine? That's what I was going to say. We fought for our freedom. They defeated the worst army, the worst cause that's ever happened before, because they were fighting for a race-based society, and Black soldiers are the ones that won it. That's the American story I want.
Isn't that a powerful story? It's such a powerful story. They fought for everyone's freedom.
For everyone's freedom.
So
and always have. Always have. Always have. Even though they were in segregated forces, even though and I write about this, about how throughout through World War II, that it was a segregated and they were treated abysmally, and yet still the Black soldier came through. That's why here in Black History Month, though, we should remember not just the first Black people to get into a white world, but why white people did what they did. If you think about the state of Mississippi or South Carolina right after the Civil War, it was majority African American in those two states, and the white people went to war to not only to create a slave republic and then expand it into Cuba, into Mexico, into the Caribbean. That's what they wanted to do. And not only did they not get that, they have equality for Black people after the war in law. And they have a Black senator from Mississippi. Yes, a Black senator from Mississippi. They have 2,000 Black men serving in high office. And so what did they do? They start a campaign of terror to execute, to intimidate Black people, to stop them from doing anything. And this ideology of the lost cause becomes, again, one other part of the system of oppression, so that white Southerners can stay in political power.
And not just political power. This is a lot about wealth. The land was over-processed, right, and was no longer producing anything that could generate any more money. So you have what they're calling property, these enslaved people, and no crops to till or process. And in the South, a Black man invents the cotton gin to improve production, probably not for the sake of wealth building, but to just solve the problem. Fingers, limbs, people are being fallen to try to complete this work. So they shipped or sold and made profit of selling their slaves that were no longer useful to the South, I loved what you said. It was an unquenchable thirst for enslaved people.
Right.
So it's the folks there then became exorbitantly wealthy. And even our good Bible, good Christian gentleman says it's harder for a camel to go through a needle than for a man to have wealth and lose it. So talk about the financial, the wealth, the economic story that rides along this, and how important this is to the conversation that you really want people to understand.
I think there are two stories. So the first is a fact, which is there were more millionaires in Mississippi than there were in Pennsylvania. But they have more millionaires there because it was on enslaved labor. The second part is where I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia. Alexandria used to be part of the District of Columbia. That's George Washington demanded it. And it left in 1847 to return to Virginia. Why? Because it was worried that the slave trade, it was worried that DC would stop the slave trade, and Alexandria couldn't do it. So they retroceded back to Virginia, and the slave market in Alexandria exploded. And I quote in the book what the people of color were saying there, which is the lamentations. They were wailing, no black churches anymore, no more schools. They had to leave their home because there weren't free people weren't allowed. So every part of the South, it was a slave society. It wasn't just that they had slavery. It was every part of the South was built on this. And that's why they went to war, to protect, and not just protect it, expand it.
They went to war within their own country to protect and expand slavery. Those are great measures. I mean, that's tremendous effort for something like that. Is it unreasonable to think that could happen again, since it meant so much, and it was the costs, the price that was willing to be paid?
I think that from this U.S. Army soldier, oh hell no. No. Because if somebody starts seceding again, I kept the uniform downstairs. If they need another soldier to stop secession and insurrection, I'm there.
I'm there. Are a fighter. Oh my God.
Oh man, I'm going to fight that because we're the United States. James Baldwin, I think, said it that I love my country and therefore I must criticize her. Oh, yes. I must criticize her. And so the idea that we can be a more perfect union, that we can be a more justice, I believe that, but we cannot do it apart. And we must try to, and if I've said that if the only way to prevent a racist future is to first understand our racist past, but that is not through sedition. It's not through insurrection. It's through understanding who we are. And we have ugly parts of our history. That doesn't mean we don't love our country because we talk about these ugly parts. We must talk about them. Otherwise, we're not going to fix them. And it just as you said earlier, we can't get to reconciliation without truth first. Don't demand us to get along and not say anything without first acknowledging who we are and what we did.
Wow. I can't imagine that anyone really wants to look in the mirror and say, wow, that's what we did. Grandpa, grandma, great grandpa, granddad, and beyond would want to say that. What are you? I mean, you've gotten death threats, for goodness sakes. Who knows how many doors just never even opened, or calls that weren't responded to simply because how dare he? It is vital that this be uprooted. It is vital for, I think, our very survival, or we'll implode again. What is that key thing you're saying to your counterparts that don't quite know, or that didn't know before, that maybe could get them in their gut to make it matter and stick?
Well, first, I was there. I did it. I grew up as a privileged white man in a de facto segregation or a de jure segregation my entire life, really, until I got into the Army. And even then, it wasn't as though this happened to me right away. But you don't own the actions of somebody who lived in the 1860s. You don't own the actions of somebody who lived in the 1930s. You don't own your great grandparents' thing. Remember that in Germany, their grandparents fought a race war too. And listen, they don't own them, but they have a responsibility to understand the past. They have a responsibility to understand what they did. Don't own your grandparents. I don't own what my grandparents or my great grandparents did. I'm me. But I do own my own response. I have a responsibility to myself. I have a responsibility to my nation and to my society to make it better and to make it more just. And that means that I'm going to tell the truth because it's ruthless. It may hurt you, but so what? I mean, we're not made of cotton candy. We can handle uncomfortable, you know? Uncomfortable never killed anyone.
No, we've been through a thing or two, and I think that discomfort is what sparked the change and made it possible for us to overcome that. Again, I have to think like how I'm thinking of the cognitive dissonance, though.
That's me.
The people
That's me.
okay.
I'm cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
Because I'm a white dude. I'm a white dude from the South who served in the Army, who taught at West Point. You would think I would be conservative, right? You would think that I would think the opposite way. But people are strange and wonderful. Not me particularly. You're way more, but people are strange in that you can't know what they're going to do. And cognitive dissonance, particularly for white people of a certain age, we need to be out front in leading in this and not just rely on our brothers and sisters of people of color to say you're going to take the lead in this. And I'm not saying I don't know what your experience was. The experience of Black people in the Jim Crow era and in enslavement is so awful. That's not, you talking about comfort and uncomfortable? That's vicious.
Oh my gosh, yes.
That's the vicious. What we're living through as white people isn't vicious. It's just a little uncomfortable. Come on, we can do this.
You said something powerful that as Black Americans or Black people, you can't remove yourself from the racist history because it's a component that you can live with every day, a part of your legacy, and how you show up and the way you view life. But white people have the luxury of choosing what to accept or not. With that conviction and responsibility, I'm hearing you say, no, you can't. You can no longer ignore this. And you must also step forward. Some people may not be as bold and as brave as you. How can you encourage, and I'm sure it's intimidating, like, oh, well, I'm supposed to do what? What do you say for those who may not have the experience that you've had to be great? I call them assets as opposed to allies. An asset to not only brothers and sisters of color, but a new way of sharing the truth, the shared understanding of the war through our language, our shared language.
And I know that for some people it's hard, but the more you talk about this, the more you write about it, we all have to do work. And work is what set me free. It's the work. It's the actual getting into the books and reading the books. And for me, the archives and getting into the archives. And when you get into the archives, when you do the history, that's what the epiphany was for me. And it can be for other people too. But you can't just be a bystander in looking about justice in our country. You got to get involved. And involved doesn't mean that you have to be marching necessarily, but you got to read. And it's not the history that I took as a kid. It's the stuff that's out here now.
What is your hope? What do you think is possible for us? I've heard them say they think it's too deep rooted to be undone. And then they were fighters for a better cause. What is your hope?
Well, I tell you, one part of it is going on the Civil Rights Trail in the South, which I'm sure you've been to parts of that, and to go to Atlanta and Memphis and Jackson and Greensboro, and there are museums in those cities in the deep South which tell an honest story. I was blown away to go to the one in Jackson. Could not believe that there is I don't know if you've been to that one. It's amazing. And they had every Mississippi State trooper in that museum understanding the violence that Mississippi State troopers had done previously. And that freshman class of Mississippi State troopers that I saw in there was 40 to 50% people of color, women and men. And I looked at that, and I went, oh my gosh, in Mississippi. So I do believe that there is hope. I know, though, that there's a fight every time. This is not going to go easy. After the Reconstruction, there was a backlash. There was a white backlash. After the Civil Rights Movement, there's a backlash. After Obama, there's a backlash. So that's why we've got to be rooted in our history and our willingness to tell the story over and over and over again. And we can do it. We can get now. Listen, we're going to have race is our slavery and segregation is our great sin in this country. It is our everlasting. Racism is the virus in the American dirt. It's our eternal pandemic. But it needs sunshine and lots of it before we can start to kill it.
How far should responsibility go? Reparations, you mentioned before, and what would that look like? Is there a way maybe we can retell the narrative, but what can we do to make good? And I thought that was a part of being gentlemen and the moral standing that we understand would be coming from the South, or even from our leadership and officers, that if we've done something wrong or made an error, we make good. How far do you think the responsibility should go, and how?
Well, I think that if you think about the original sort of 40 acres that Sherman said he was going to give to the free Black people in Georgia, and did give them, and then Andrew Johnson took it away. I mean, that's one. So there was no monetary settlement that came from the enslaved experience. Then you look at how segregation worked in the Jim Crow era, and it created these segregated communities. The FHA and VA loans weren't given to Black people. The VA, the GI Bill didn't go to Black people. Social Security was created to exclude Black people when domestics, farm workers, and all this. So if you think about the entire law, of our entire life, it was to exclude Black people from generational wealth. So the first thing we got to do is to get the story, to understand why we're here, because there's a reason why Black families have 1/10 the wealth of white families, and it's because of de jure segregation and policy and law. It's not because some innate reason Black people don't. There's a real reason. It's the law. So we've got to understand that. And yes, there has to be some way that we can change that, and that always creates white backlash. Yeah, so the only way to stop that white backlash is, I believe, is by getting the story out and telling why it is that we are like we are. There's a reason. There's a historical reason for this. So I think history leads so that we can get to a place where we can do it. And I don't know what the reparations should look like, but I know there has got to be something to make our society more equitable and more just. And the problem is, if we gave however much money to every Black family, it doesn't undo the systemic nature of injustice in America. It doesn't do it. It doesn't do it. So it's got to be something even more fundamental than what we have now.
Sure. I find myself confused oftentimes, because I'm like, well, but there's so much damage, the dysfunction and all the other things that go along with it, just to even untrain it. So I value that. Ty, you have been an amazing guest and author to speak with. Your contribution to the world is certainly good. I just want to end with this. We're changing the narrative, and this isn't all of the story. You met your demons. You made good on your promise to America and what you honored. What is the call out, the invitation, or the where do we go from here, especially you, now that you've got some momentum?
Yeah, I would like more people to understand their own history, because if they scratch the surface of whatever town they live in, whatever community they are across the country, they'll find the same thing that I did in Alexandria, Virginia, in Monroe, Georgia, at West Point, and in the Army. They'll find the same thing. It's there if you just scratch the surface and look a little bit. So I would invite people to go look at your own history, whether it's your personal history or your town's history. You'll find the same thing I did, and it will change you.
Yes, and it most certainly has. And I highly recommend you run out immediately. Well, don't run out. Log on, call them, Novel Neighbor, our bookstore partner, and get this book. Get it as soon as you can, and scratch and sniff, scratch the surface and sniff. Scratch and sniff, scratch the surface, and watch how much can unfold and what great good that can happen. And we can come to peace and terms with it if we can dispel the myth. Ty Seidule, thank you for being this terrific guy today and for sharing your time and story with us all.
Oh, Jade, thank you. I mean, you've been wonderful. We could talk. I think we could talk for hours, don't you?
Let's make a commitment to
Let's
touch
make a
that
commitment.
base and do some more.
Yeah, and I do want to thank the St. Louis County
Yes,
Library, AGC Media, Novel Neighbor. What a great experience this has been. Thank you so much.
fantastic, Ty. St. Louis County Library, we thank you again for this special author for this author series.